Grace Ann, a reserved and introspective young woman, attends a family gathering at the insistence of her aunt. Little does she know, the event is more than a social affair. It's a turning point in her life. Among the sea of faces, one person stands out: Ronald, a tall and enigmatic man whose sharp eyes seem to pierce through her guarded walls. Ronald is introduced to Grace and by his housekeeper, Manong, who has been with his family for years. Manang's warmth is a stark contrast to Ronald's stoic demeanor. Grace Ann is immediately drawn to Ronald's presence, though his curt responses make it clear he isn't easily approachable. As the evening progresses, Grace Ann notices Ronald observing her from a distance. His intense gaze unsettles her, yet she feels a pull toward him that she can't explain. When they finally speak, their conversation is brief but charged with unspoken tension. Ronald's words are carefully measured, and his smile is fleeting, hinting at a man burdened by secrets. Grace Ann finds herself drawn back to Ronald's estate under unexpected circumstances, and this time, she gets to know Manong more deeply. Sitting together in the grand but eerily quiet living room, Grace Ann listens as Manong shares stories about Ronald's past. "Manong, have you been with Ronald for a long time?" Grace Ann asks curiously. Manong smiles warmly and nods. "Since he was a baby, I've watched him grow, seen his struggles and his triumphs." There's a moment of silence before Manong continues. "You know, earlier, when Ronald introduced you to me, his smile reached the sky. I haven't seen him smile like that in years." Grace Ann frowns, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Manong sighs deeply, her expression shadowed by sadness. His mother, Ma'am Samantha, almost left him and his father, Sir Ziggy, when Ronald was just a boy. "Left them? Why?" Grace Ann asks, her voice laced with concern. "For another man," Manong replies gravely. "Ronald's mother nearly walked away from her family for someone else. It was a dark time for all of them, and it left scars. That's why Ronald is so afraid of being abandoned." Before Grace Ann can respond, Ronald's voice cuts through the quiet atmosphere. "Manong." Both women gasp, startled. Ronald's expression is stern as he approaches. "Manong, can you leave us for a moment?" he asks firmly. Manong nods quickly and excuses herself, leaving Grace Ann alone with Ronald. The silence that follows is heavy, but Grace Ann senses the vulnerability beneath Ronald's stoic exterior. "I didn't mean to pry," Grace Ann begins hesitantly, but Ronald shakes his head. "It's fine," he says, his tone softer than she expected. "Everyone knows my parents didn't love each other the way a husband and wife should. My father did everything for my mother, but it was never enough. I overheard him once, saying that my mother planned to leave us for another man. A man named Eduardo." Grace Ann freezes at the mention of Eduardo. The name strikes a chord deep within her, and her mind races with memories of her own father, a man she knows as Eduardo. Ronald continues, his voice laced with bitterness. "I hate that man for what he almost did to my family. I've forgiven my mother, but the pain of knowing she considered leaving us for someone else, it's not something you forget easily." Grace Ann struggles to process the revelation, her heart aching for Ronald while grappling with the possibility that Eduardo could be the same man who fathered her. "Is there a problem, Grace Ann?" Ronald's question jolts her back to the present. She forces a smile, shaking her head. "No, nothing. I'm just here for you." She places a gentle hand on his cheek, hoping to convey her sincerity. Ronald surprises her by leaning in, capturing her lips in a kiss filled with raw emotion. Grace Ann is swept away by the intensity of the moment. His hands move to her waist, pulling her closer as their connection deepens. Ronald, wait," she whispers breathlessly as his kisses trail down her neck. Summoning her strength, she gently pushes him away. "And not here," she stammers, her cheeks flushed. Ronald steps back, his dark eyes searching hers for a moment before nodding. "You're right. I'm sorry." But the look in his eyes tells Grace Ann that their connection is far from over. The days that follow are a mix of longing and uncertainty for Grace. She can't shake the memory of Ronald's kiss or the weight of the secrets that now lie between them. Her feelings for him grow stronger, but so do her fears about the truth of Eduardo's identity. Manong notices Grace Ann's quiet demeanor and offers her words of comfort. Ronald has been through a lot, Grace, but I see the way he looks at you. He's not the type to trust easily, but you've already made a difference in his life. Encouraged by Manong's words, Grace Ann decides to visit Ronald's estate again. This time, she finds him alone in the garden, staring at a wilted patch of flowers. "This used to be my mother's favorite spot," Ronald says without turning around. "She used to tend to this garden every day, before everything fell apart." Grace Ann steps closer, her heart aching for him. "You don't have to carry this alone, Ronald." He finally looks at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. "What if I told you I'm afraid of letting anyone in, of being left again?" Grace Ann reaches out, taking his hand in hers. "Then let me prove to you that I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Ronald allows himself to believe in the possibility of happiness. But as their bond deepens, Grace Ann knows that the shadow of Eduardo looms over them, threatening to unravel everything they've built. The seeds of love and trust are planted between Grace Ann and Ronald, but with secrets yet to be revealed, their journey is only beginning. As days turned into weeks, Grace Ann found herself more entangled in Ronald's life. She spent more time at his estate, a sprawling yet somber place that seemed to echo the weight of his past. Though she cherished their growing bond, the unanswered question of Eduardo's identity lingered in the back of her mind. One afternoon, Grace Ann found herself in the library, its shelves stacked with dusty books and forgotten memories. Ronald entered quietly, his presence as commanding as ever. "Do you enjoy being here?" he asked, breaking the silence. Grace Ann smiled faintly. "It's peaceful. I can see why you retreat here." Ronald studied her for a moment before sitting across from her. "I used to hide here as a child. This was my sanctuary when things got difficult at home." His voice carried a tinge of sadness, and Grace Ann's heart ached for him. She reached out, placing a comforting hand on his. "You're not alone anymore, Ronald." For a fleeting moment, his guard seemed to lower, and he gave her a small smile. "You have no idea how much that means to me." But just as the atmosphere softened, a loud knock interrupted them. Manong appeared in the doorway, her expression anxious. "Sir Ronald, there's someone here to see you," she said cautiously. Ronald's demeanor instantly changed. He stood abruptly, his face hardening into the familiar mask of indifference. "I'll be there shortly," he said curtly before leaving the room. Grace Ann watched him go, her curiosity piqued. She had learned enough about Ronald to know that visitors were a rarity, and whoever this was, it wasn't someone he welcomed eagerly. Unable to suppress her curiosity, Grace Ann followed quietly, keeping a safe distance as Ronald met the visitor in the grand foyer. The man standing there was tall and sharply dressed, exuding an air of arrogance that set Grace Ann on edge. "Ronald," the man greeted with a smirk, his voice smooth but insincere. "Eduardo," Ronald replied coldly, his jaw tightening. Grace Ann's breath hitched. Eduardo, the name she had been dreading. Could this man be her father? The possibility sent a shiver down her spine. "What are you doing here?" Ronald demanded, his tone laced with contempt. "I came to see how you're doing," Eduardo said with feigned concern. "It's been a while, hasn't it?" Ronald's laughter was bitter. "Don't pretend you care. You've done enough damage." Eduardo's smirk faltered, and his eyes narrowed. "I admit I made mistakes, but I never meant to hurt your family." "Save your excuses," Ronald snapped. "You almost destroyed us. My father may have forgiven you, but I never will." The tension in the room was palpable, and Grace Ann felt like an intruder in a deeply personal moment. She wanted to step forward, to comfort Ronald, but fear held her back. Before leaving, Eduardo glanced around the room, his gaze briefly landing on Grace Ann's shadowed figure. For a moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. After Eduardo left, Ronald stood frozen in place, his hands clenched into fists. Grayson hesitated before stepping forward, her voice gentle. "Are you okay?" He turned to her, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions. Why do people like him think they can just waltz back into your life as if nothing happened? Grayson didn't know how to respond. Instead, she walked up to him and wrapped her arms around him, offering silent support. For the first time, Ronald didn't pull away. In the days following Eduardo's visit, Ronald withdrew into himself. He spent hours in his study, refusing to talk about what had happened. Grayson gave him space but couldn't shake the feeling that he needed her. One evening, she found him in the garden, sitting on the bench near the wilted flower bed he had once told her about. The fading sunlight cast long shadows, making the moment feel both serene and somber. "Ronald," she called softly, approaching him. He looked up, his expression weary but grateful. "Grayson, I didn't hear you come out." She sat beside him, the silence between them comforting in its own way. "I know you don't want to talk about Eduardo, but I want you to know I'm here if you need me." Ronald sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just him. It's everything. My family, my past. Sometimes it feels like I'll never escape it." Grayson placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to face it alone anymore. Let me help you carry some of that weight." For a moment, Ronald said nothing. Then, to her surprise, he reached out and took her hand in his. "Thank you," he said quietly. Their connection deepened that night, though neither of them spoke of it directly. It was as if an unspoken understanding had formed between them, a bond that grew stronger with each shared moment. But as Grayson left the garden, her heart heavy with the knowledge of Eduardo's potential connection to her, she couldn't help but wonder if her own secrets would one day drive a wedge between them. Little did she know, the shadows of the past were only beginning to reveal themselves. Grayson sat on the edge of her bed, the evening's events replaying in her mind. Ronald's pain was evident, and Eduardo's presence was a looming shadow she couldn't ignore. She stared at the photo she kept tucked away in her belongings. Her father, Eduardo, smiling as he held her as a child. The possibility that her father was the same man who had caused so much pain to Ronald's family felt like a cruel twist of fate. The next morning, Grayson resolved to uncover the truth. She approached Manong in the kitchen, hoping to gather more information about Eduardo. "Manong, can I ask you something?" Grayson said hesitantly as she helped peel vegetables. Manong looked up from her work, her kind eyes curious. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" "Eduardo. What do you know about him?" Grayson tried to keep her tone casual. Manong's expression darkened, and she let out a heavy sigh. "Eduardo is a name that brings nothing but pain to this house. He was, well, let's just say he had a relationship with Ma'am Samantha that caused a lot of trouble." Grayson's heart sank. "Do you think he ever truly cared about her?" Manong shook her head. "I can't say, but whatever his intentions were, they nearly tore this family apart. Ronald was just a boy when it all happened, but it left scars that never fully healed." Grayson nodded, her mind racing. She needed to confirm if Eduardo was indeed her father. But how could she reveal such a connection to Ronald without losing him? Ronald was unusually quiet during dinner that evening, his gaze distant as he pushed his food around his plate. Grayson watched him closely, wanting to say something but unsure how to break the silence. "Ronald," she began gently, "you've been quiet all day. Is everything okay?" He looked up, his expression guarded. "I've just been thinking about everything. Eduardo's visit, it brought back memories I'd rather forget." Grayson hesitated before reaching for his hand. "You don't have to face this alone. I'm here for you." Ronald's eyes softened as he squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Grayson. It means more than you know." Before she could respond, Ronald's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. "It's Eduardo," he said bitterly, standing up. "Excuse me." Grayson watched as he left the room, her heart heavy. She knew she needed to tell him the truth about her connection to Eduardo, but the timing never seemed right. The longer she waited, the harder it became. Later that night, as Grace walked through the garden to clear her mind, she found Ronald sitting on the bench, his head in his hands. She approached cautiously. "Ronald." He looked up, his expression weary. "He wants to meet again. Says he has something important to tell me." Grace sat beside him, her heart pounding. "Are you going to go?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to hear him out, but another part of me wants nothing to do with him." Grace placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you." Ronald looked at her, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "You're too good to me, Grace. I don't deserve you." She shook her head, her own smile tinged with sadness. "Don't say that. You deserve happiness, Ronald. You just have to let yourself believe it." The following day, Ronald decided to meet Eduardo at a neutral location, a quiet cafe in the city. Grace insisted on accompanying him, though she stayed out of sight, sitting at a table near the back. Ronald sat across from Eduardo, his posture stiff and his expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," Eduardo began, his tone unusually sincere. "Get to the point," Ronald said curtly. Eduardo sighed. "I know I've made mistakes, and I'm not here to make excuses, but there's something you need to know about your mother and about me." Ronald's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Eduardo hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if searching for the right words. "Your mother. She wasn't as innocent as you think. Our relationship wasn't just a fling. She loved me, Ronald, and for a time, I thought I loved her too." Ronald's fists clenched under the table. "Don't you dare speak about her like that." "I'm not trying to disrespect her," Eduardo said quickly. I want you to understand that there's more to the story than you know." Grace Ann's heart pounded as she listened from her seat. She couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood and approached their table, her hands trembling. "Eduardo," she said softly. Both men turned to her, surprise etched on their faces. "Grace Ann?" Ronald asked, his confusion evident. Eduardo's eyes widened as he took in her face. "Grace Ann? Is it really you?" Ronald looked between them, his expression darkening. "You know each other?" Grace Ann swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "Ronald, I didn't know how to tell you. Eduardo is my father." The silence that followed was deafening. Ronald's face turned pale, and his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. "Your father?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace Ann nodded, her tears spilling over. "I didn't know he was the Eduardo you were talking about. I swear, Ronald, I didn't know." Ronald stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to go," he said, his voice cold and distant. "Ronald, please," Grace Ann began, but he shook his head. "I can't do this right now," he said before walking out of the cafe. Grace Ann watched him leave, her heart breaking. She turned to Eduardo, who looked equally stunned. "You should have told me," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't know you were involved with him," Eduardo admitted. "If I had known." Grace Ann shook her head, unable to process everything. She left the cafe, her mind racing. She had feared this moment for weeks, and now that it had come, it was worse than she could have imagined. Ronald drove aimlessly through the city, his grip tight on the steering wheel. The revelation about Grace Ann's connection to Eduardo felt like a dagger to his heart. Betrayal wasn't new to him, but having it come from someone he had started to trust and care for was a pain he wasn't prepared for. Meanwhile, Grace Ann returned to the estate, her mind racing. She had tried calling Ronald several times, but each call went unanswered. She sat in her room, staring at her phone, tears streaming down her face. "How could I have let this happen?" she whispered to herself. Manong knocked softly on the door before stepping in. "Grace Ann, are you okay?" Grace Ann shook her head, unable to find the words. Manong sat beside her and gently patted her shoulder. "I saw Ronald leave earlier. He looked upset. Did something happen?" Grayson hesitated before nodding. He found out about Eduardo. Manang's expression darkened. Oh dear, that explains a lot. I didn't mean for it to come out like this, Grayson said, her voice cracking. I wanted to tell him, but I was scared. And now, I've ruined everything. Manong sighed deeply. Ronald has been through a lot, Grace. He's built walls around his heart to protect himself. But I've seen how much you mean to him. He just needs time to process this. Grayson nodded, clinging to the hope that Ronald would eventually understand. The next day, Grayson decided to visit Ronald at his office. She knew she couldn't let things end the way they had. As she entered the building, she felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. The receptionist gave her a sympathetic look before pointing her toward Ronald's office. When she walked in, Ronald was seated at his desk, reviewing documents. He looked up, his expression hardening when he saw her. Grayson, he said coldly, what are you doing here? I needed to see you, she said, her voice trembling. I need to explain. There's nothing to explain, Ronald said, standing up. You kept something from me, something that matters. I didn't know Eduardo was the same man from your past, Grayson insisted. If I had known, I would have told you. That doesn't change the fact that you're his daughter, Ronald said bitterly. Do you know what he did to my family? Do you understand the pain he caused us? Grayson's eyes filled with tears. I do, Ronald. And I'm sorry. I can't change who my father is, but I'm not him. Please don't punish me for his mistakes. Ronald looked away, his jaw tightening. For a moment, there was silence between them. You should go, he finally said, his voice devoid of emotion. Ronald, please, Grayson pleaded. Go, he repeated, his tone firmer. Defeated, Grayson turned and walked out of the office, her heart breaking with each step. Several days passed, and Grayson tried to keep herself busy, though her thoughts constantly drifted to Ronald. She spent hours reflecting on their conversations, trying to figure out how to fix things. One afternoon, Eduardo paid her a surprise visit. She was sitting in the garden when she saw him approaching, his expression somber. Grayson, he said, sitting beside her. Why are you here? She asked, her tone weary. I heard what happened with Ronald, Eduardo said. I wanted to check on you. Grayson shook her head. This is all your fault. If it weren't for you, none of this would have happened. Eduardo sighed. I know I've made mistakes, but I never wanted to hurt you. Or Ronald. Then why did you come back into his life? Grayson demanded. Because I wanted to make things right, Eduardo said. I know I can't undo the past, but I wanted to at least try to apologize. Grayson looked at him, her anger giving way to sadness. He hates me now because of you. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fix things. Eduardo placed a hand on her shoulder. Give him time. Ronald's a good man. He'll see the truth eventually. Later that evening, Grayson sat by the window in her room, staring out at the stars. She thought about Eduardo's words and wondered if there was any chance of reconciliation with Ronald. As she sat there, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Manong. Ronald is here. He's in the garden. Her heart skipped a beat as she quickly made her way downstairs. She found Ronald standing under the gazebo, his hands in his pockets. Ronald, she said softly. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. I needed to talk to you. Grayson's heart raced as she stood a few feet away from Ronald. She wasn't sure what to expect, a confrontation, perhaps, or maybe more rejection. But his tone was calm, almost vulnerable, and it gave her a glimmer of hope. I've been thinking a lot these past few days, Ronald began, his eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away. About us, about Eduardo, about everything. Grayson clenched her hands together, willing herself to stay calm. And what did you decide? Ronald let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. I can't deny how much Eduardo's actions hurt my family, but it's not fair to hold you accountable for his mistakes. You're not him, Grace. Tears welled up in her eyes. Ronald, I never wanted to hurt you. If I had known how much pain my father caused you, I would have told you everything from the start." He nodded, his expression softening. "I know that now. I've been carrying this anger for so long that it's clouded my judgment. But you've shown me kindness, patience, and understanding, things I haven't felt in years." Grace and took a cautious step forward. "Does this mean?" Ronald looked at her, his gaze filled with an emotion she hadn't seen before. "It means I want to try. I don't want to let the shadows of the past ruin what we could have." She couldn't hold back her tears any longer. They streamed down her face as she closed the distance between them. Ronald reached out, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "I'm sorry for how I treated you," he said softly. "You didn't deserve that." "I forgive you," Grayson whispered, "and I'll do whatever it takes to help you heal." Ronald pulled her into a hug, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I want us to move forward," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "But it won't be easy. There are still things I need to work through." "I'll be here," Grayson assured him, "for as long as it takes." Ronald tightened his hold on her. "Thank you, Grayson, for everything." As they stood there under the gazebo, the stars twinkling above them, Grayson felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead might be difficult, but they were willing to face it together. The following days marked the beginning of a fragile yet hopeful reconciliation between Ronald and Grayson. The weight of the past was still present, but there was an unspoken agreement to move forward together. Grayson took extra care to ensure her actions reassured Ronald of her sincerity. Every small gesture, her smile, the way she spoke his name, her willingness to listen, helped chip away at the walls he had built around himself. Ronald, however, remained cautious. He couldn't simply erase years of pain with a few kind words, but he saw Grayson's efforts. Late at night, he often replayed their conversations in his mind, wondering if she might truly be the one to help him mend his broken heart. One afternoon, Grayson decided to visit Ronald at his family estate. She carried a basket filled with freshly baked goods, hoping the gesture would bring some warmth into their conversations. When she arrived, she found him in the garden, pruning the roses. "These are beautiful," Grayson said, admiring the vibrant blooms. Ronald looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "My father planted these. He said they symbolized resilience, how beauty can thrive even in harsh conditions." Grayson reached out to touch one of the petals, her eyes meeting his. "It sounds like he was a wise man." Ronald nodded, his expression softening. "He was. He taught me a lot about love and forgiveness. I wish I had listened more when I was younger." They spent the afternoon tending to the garden together, their conversation flowing naturally. For the first time in years, Ronald felt a sense of peace. Just as things seemed to be improving, an unexpected letter arrived at Ronald's doorstep. It was from Eduardo. Ronald stared at the envelope, his hands trembling. He hadn't expected to hear from the man who had nearly destroyed his family. Grayson noticed his distress and gently placed a hand on his arm. "Do you want me to read it for you?" she offered. Ronald shook his head. "No, I need to do this myself." He opened the letter and began to read. Eduardo's words were filled with regret and an earnest plea for forgiveness. He admitted his mistakes and expressed a desire to make amends, not just with Ronald, but with Grayson as well. Ronald's jaw tightened as he finished the letter. "I don't know if I can forgive him," he admitted. Grayson hesitated before speaking. "Forgiveness isn't about him, Ronald. It's about freeing yourself from the pain he caused. Holding on to anger will only hurt you more." Her words struck a chord with him, but he wasn't ready to let go just yet. Later that evening, Ronald found himself sitting alone in his study, staring at the letter. Memories of his mother's heartbreak flooded his mind, and he felt a familiar anger rising within him. But alongside it was Grayson's voice, urging him to choose peace over bitterness. The next day, Grayson encouraged Ronald to meet Eduardo in person. Though reluctant, he agreed. knowing he couldn't move forward without confronting his past. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe in town. When Eduardo walked in, Ronald immediately recognized him. The man looked older, his face etched with regret. As Eduardo approached, Ronald felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a faint glimmer of curiosity. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Eduardo said, his voice trembling. Ronald nodded curtly, his guard still up. "Say what you need to say." Eduardo took a deep breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am. What I did to your family was selfish and wrong. I was blinded by my own desires, and I hurt people who didn't deserve it." Ronald's fists clenched under the table. "You think an apology can erase what you did? My mother almost left us because of you." "I know," Eduardo admitted, his voice breaking, "and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But I want to make things right, if you'll let me." The tension between them was palpable. Ronald's anger simmered just below the surface, but he couldn't ignore the sincerity in Eduardo's words. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Ronald said finally, "but I'm willing to try, for Grace Ann's sake." Eduardo's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." As they left the cafe, Grace Ann was waiting outside. Ronald walked over to her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. "How did it go?" she asked softly. "It's a start," he replied. Grayson smiled and took his hand. "That's all that matters." For the first time in years, Ronald felt the weight of his past begin to lift. It wouldn't be an easy journey, but with Grace and by his side, he believed it was possible to find peace, and maybe even happiness, once again. Ronald's decision to meet Eduardo had been a significant step forward, but the aftermath lingered like a storm on the horizon. He found himself grappling with his emotions in the days that followed. Grace Ann, ever supportive, made it her mission to remind him that healing was a process, not an overnight miracle. One evening, Grace Ann prepared dinner at Ronald's estate, a quiet effort to provide some normalcy amidst the chaos. As the aroma of roasted chicken and herbs filled the air, Ronald entered the kitchen, his face lined with weariness. "You're spoiling me, Grace Ann," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You deserve it," she replied, setting the table. "Besides, cooking helps me think." He sat down, watching her move gracefully around the kitchen. "And what are you thinking about tonight?" She paused, considering her words. "I'm thinking about how proud I am of you for facing Eduardo. That took courage, Ronald." He leaned back in his chair, letting out a heavy sigh. It didn't feel courageous. It felt necessary. "And that's what makes it brave," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where the warmth of the fireplace added a cozy ambience. Ronald opened up about his conflicting feelings toward Eduardo, the bitterness he couldn't shake, and the faint hope that maybe forgiveness was possible. "I'm not sure how to let go of the anger," he admitted, staring into the flames. Grayson reached for his hand. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. One step at a time, remember?" Her words resonated with him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of relief, knowing he didn't have to face his demons alone. Ronald and Grace Ann's bond deepened as they spent more time together. Their shared moments ranged from quiet walks in the garden to lively debates about books and movies. Ronald found himself smiling more, laughing at her playful remarks, and feeling a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. One weekend, Grayson suggested a trip to the countryside. "You need a break, Ronald. Let's get away for a while." He hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. They packed a small bag and drove out to a picturesque village surrounded by rolling hills and vibrant fields of wildflowers. The fresh air and scenic views were a welcome change. They stayed in a charming cottage, where Grace Ann insisted on cooking every meal. Ronald teased her about her determination, but he secretly loved her effort to make him feel cared for. On their second evening there, they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Grace Ann leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a moment, Everything felt perfect. "Thank you for bringing me here," he said, his voice low. "You needed it," she replied, smiling up at him. "And so did I." As the stars appeared one by one, Ronald realized how much Grayson meant to him. She wasn't just a source of comfort, she was a light guiding him out of the darkness. Their idyllic retreat was cut short when Ronald received an unexpected phone call. It was from his family lawyer, informing him that Eduardo had requested a formal meeting to discuss matters related to the family business. "I don't understand," Ronald said, pacing the cottage. "Why would he involve himself in our business affairs?" Grayson watched him carefully. "Maybe he's trying to make amends. Or he's trying to manipulate his way back into our lives," Ronald retorted, his frustration evident. Despite his reservations, Ronald agreed to the meeting. Grayson accompanied him for moral support, offering words of encouragement as they drove back to the city. The meeting took place in a sleek office building downtown. Eduardo was already waiting when they arrived, looking nervous but determined. "Thank you for coming," Eduardo began, his tone earnest. "I know I don't deserve your trust, but I want to do right by your family. That includes ensuring the business remains strong." Ronald crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I owe it to you and your father," Eduardo said, his voice steady. "I've made mistakes, Ronald, but I'm not here to take anything from you. I want to help." The conversation was tense, but Grayson's presence helped diffuse some of the hostility. She gently nudged Ronald to consider Eduardo's perspective, reminding him that people could change. By the end of the meeting, Ronald agreed to let Eduardo provide consulting advice for a limited period, under strict conditions. It wasn't trust, but it was a step toward reconciliation. Later that night, Grayson and Ronald sat together in his study. "You handled that well," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. She smiled. "That's what partners are for." The word partners lingered in the air, and Ronald realized just how much Grayson had become a part of his life. She wasn't just helping him heal, she was becoming his reason to believe in love again. Ronald couldn't shake the weight of the meeting with Eduardo. Although he agreed to the consulting arrangement, his mind buzzed with questions. Grayson noticed his restlessness as they sat together in the study. "Ronald, you've been quiet since we got back. What's on your mind?" she asked softly, placing a comforting hand on his arm. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I keep wondering why Eduardo is so eager to help. It doesn't add up." Grayson pondered his words. Maybe he genuinely regrets his past actions. Or maybe there's something more he hasn't told you. Ronald nodded, his jaw tightening. "If there's more to the story, I need to know. I can't move forward without understanding the truth." The next day, Ronald decided to dig deeper into Eduardo's past. Using his family's network, he discreetly contacted an investigator to uncover any hidden details about Eduardo's involvement with his mother, Samantha, and their family business. Meanwhile, Grayson focused on supporting Ronald emotionally. She kept his spirits up by planning small surprises, a homemade dinner, a handwritten note, or a shared walk in the garden. These moments of calm amidst the chaos reminded Ronald of her unwavering presence in his life. A week later, the investigator returned with a file. Ronald's hands trembled as he opened it, Grayson sitting beside him for support. The report revealed that Eduardo had once been deeply in debt, borrowing money from questionable sources. Samantha had helped him financially, but their relationship was not what it seemed. While Eduardo had feelings for Samantha, she never reciprocated. She only wanted to help a struggling friend, but Eduardo misinterpreted her kindness, leading to the tension that nearly tore their family apart. Ronald exhaled deeply, his mind reeling. "So, my mother wasn't leaving us for Eduardo. She was trying to help him, but his obsession made it look like she was." Grayson squeezed his hand. It seems Eduardo acted out of desperation, not malice. Maybe his recent actions are an attempt to atone for the damage he caused. Ronald nodded slowly. "It doesn't excuse what he did, but at least I understand now." Armed with this new perspective, Ronald decided to confront Eduardo again. He invited him to dinner at his estate, determined to lay everything on the table. When Eduardo arrived, he looked apprehensive but hopeful. Grayson greeted him warmly, setting a welcoming tone for the evening. Over dinner, Ronald shared what he had learned. Eduardo listened silently, his expression a mix of guilt and relief. "You misunderstood my mother's intentions," Ronald said, his tone firm but not accusatory. "She wanted to help you, not leave her family." Eduardo lowered his gaze. "I know that now, but back then, I was blinded by my feelings. I made terrible choices, Ronald, and I've lived with the regret ever since." There was a pause as Ronald absorbed Eduardo's words. Finally, he said, "I don't know if I can forgive you completely, but I'm willing to give you a chance to prove that you've changed." Eduardo looked up, gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you, Ronald. That means more than you know." Grayson watched the exchange, her heart swelling with pride for Ronald. She knew how difficult it was for him to extend even a sliver of trust to Eduardo, and it reaffirmed her belief in his strength of character. As the days passed, Ronald began to see Eduardo in a new light. While their relationship was far from perfect, they managed to establish a tentative peace. Eduardo's contributions to the family business proved insightful, and Ronald couldn't deny that his expertise was valuable. Meanwhile, Ronald and Grayson's relationship continued to flourish. They spent more time together, sharing their hopes and fears with a level of intimacy neither had experienced before. Ronald often marveled at Grayson's ability to bring light into his darkest moments, and she cherished the way he made her feel safe and loved. One evening, as they walked hand in hand through the garden, Ronald turned to Grace and with a serious expression. "You've been my rock through all of this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I would have faced any of it without you." Grayson smiled, her eyes shimmering in the moonlight. "You're stronger than you think, Ronald. I'm just here to remind you of that." He stopped walking, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "Grayson, I don't want to imagine my life without you. You've shown me what it means to trust and love again." Her heart swelled at his words. "And you've shown me what it means to be truly seen and valued," she replied softly. As they stood there under the stars, their connection deepened, cementing the bond that had grown between them over time. Little did they know, new challenges loomed on the horizon. Challenges that would test their love and resilience in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But for now, they found solace in each other, ready to face whatever came next together. The tentative peace Ronald had established with Eduardo didn't last long, as Eduardo settled into his consulting role within the family business. Rumors began to circulate among employees. Whispers of his previous financial mismanagement and his history with Samantha spread like wildfire, threatening to destabilize the fragile trust Ronald had worked so hard to rebuild. One afternoon, as Ronald reviewed the company's quarterly projections in his office, Grayson entered with a troubled expression. "Ronald, there's something you need to know," she said, placing a stack of printed emails on his desk. He raised an eyebrow, setting aside his pen. "What is it?" "Some employees have been exchanging messages about Eduardo. They're questioning your decision to bring him on board," she explained, her voice laced with concern. Ronald scanned the emails, his jaw tightening with every line he read. Accusations of favoritism, suspicions about Eduardo's motives, and harsh criticisms of his leadership filled the pages. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Ronald muttered, leaning back in his chair. Grayson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You need to address this before it spirals out of control. The employees need to hear directly from you." Taking her advice, Ronald called for a company-wide meeting. Standing before his employees, he addressed their concerns head-on. "I understand your doubts about Eduardo's involvement," he began, his tone measured but firm. "Bringing him on was not a decision I made lightly. He has valuable experience that can help this company thrive. However, if anyone has concerns or suggestions, my door is always open." The room was silent as Ronald concluded his speech. Grayson, standing at the back, watched with admiration as he handled the situation with poise. Later that evening, Ronald and Grace discussed the fallout over dinner. "You were incredible today," she said, smiling warmly. Ronald sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just hope it's enough to ease their concerns." Grace reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "It will be. You're a strong leader, Ronald, and people respect you. They'll come around." Despite Ronald's efforts, tension within the company persisted. Eduardo tried to keep a low profile, but his presence alone was enough to stir unease among the staff. Meanwhile, Ronald found himself under immense pressure, juggling the demands of the business and the emotional toll of navigating his complicated relationship with Eduardo. One evening, as Ronald worked late in his office, Grayson arrived with a thermos of coffee and a plate of sandwiches. "You're burning the midnight oil again," she teased, setting the tray on his desk. Ronald smiled tiredly. "There's just so much to do. Every time I think I'm making progress, something else comes up." Grace perched on the edge of his desk, her expression serious. "You can't keep carrying all of this on your own, Ronald. Let me help." He hesitated, then nodded. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Grayson." Role within the family business, rumors began to circulate among employees. Whispers of his previous financial mismanagement and his history with Samantha spread like wildfire, threatening to destabilize the fragile trust Ronald had worked so hard to rebuild. One afternoon, as Ronald reviewed the company's quarterly projections in his office, Grace entered with a troubled expression. "Ronald, there's something you need to know," she said, placing a stack of printed emails on his desk. He raised an eyebrow, setting aside his pen. "What is it?" "Some employees have been exchanging messages about Eduardo. They're questioning your decision to bring him on board," she explained, her voice laced with concern. Ronald scanned the emails, his jaw tightening with every line he read. Accusations of favoritism, suspicions about Eduardo's motives, and harsh criticisms of his leadership filled the pages. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Ronald muttered, leaning back in his chair. Grace placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You need to address this before it spirals out of control. The employees need to hear directly from you." Taking her advice, Ronald called for a company-wide meeting. Standing before his employees, he addressed their concerns head-on. "I understand your doubts about Eduardo's involvement," he began, his tone measured but firm. "Bringing him on was not a decision I made lightly. He has valuable experience that can help this company thrive. However, if anyone has concerns or suggestions, my door is always open." The room was silent as Ronald concluded his speech. Grace, standing at the back, watched with admiration as he handled the situation with poise. Later that evening, Ronald and Grace discussed the fallout over dinner. "You were incredible today," she said, smiling warmly. Ronald sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just hope it's enough to ease their concerns." Grace reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "It will be. You're a strong leader, Ronald, and people respect you. They'll come around." Despite Ronald's efforts, tension within the company persisted. Eduardo tried to keep a low profile, but his presence alone was enough to stir unease among the staff. Meanwhile, Ronald found himself under immense pressure, juggling the demands of the business and the emotional toll of navigating his complicated relationship with Eduardo. One evening, as Ronald worked late in his office, Grayson arrived with a thermos of coffee and a plate of sandwiches. "You're burning the midnight oil again," she teased, setting the tray on his desk. Ronald smiled tiredly. "There's just so much to do. Every time I think I'm making progress, something else comes up." Grace perched on the edge of his desk, her expression serious. "You can't keep carrying all of this on your own, Ronald. Let me help." He hesitated, then nodded. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Grayson." Over the next few weeks, Grace became more involved in the business, helping Ronald manage his workload and offering her insight on employee relations. Her presence brought a sense of calm to the office, and even Eduardo seemed to respond positively to her influence. But the peace was short-lived. One afternoon, an anonymous letter was delivered to Ronald's office. The letter accused Eduardo of embezzling funds during his previous business ventures and warned Ronald to keep a close eye on him. Ronald's hands shook as he read the letter. He immediately called Eduardo into his office. "Do you know anything about this?" Ronald demanded, holding up the letter. Eduardo's face paled. "I swear, Ronald, I've done nothing wrong. Someone is trying to sabotage me." Ronald studied Eduardo's expression, searching for any signs of deceit. "I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt for now, but if I find out you've been lying to me, there will be consequences." Eduardo nodded solemnly. "I understand." As tensions reached their peak, Grace became Ronald's anchor. She encouraged him to trust his instincts and reminded him of the importance of transparency. "You've worked so hard to build this company, Ronald," she said one evening as they walked through the garden. "Don't let fear or doubt cloud your judgment." Ronald sighed, pulling her close. "You're right. I need to focus on what's best for the business and for us." The following week, Ronald implemented stricter financial oversight within the company, ensuring that every transaction was thoroughly reviewed. Eduardo complied without complaint, eager to prove his innocence. Meanwhile, Grace took it upon herself to investigate the source of the anonymous letter. She discreetly questioned employees, piecing together clues that eventually led her to a disgruntled former manager who had been fired for misconduct. Confronting the manager, Grace uncovered the truth. The letter was a fabrication, written out of spite. She immediately reported her findings to Ronald, who was both relieved and furious. "Why didn't you tell me you were doing this?" he asked, his tone a mix of concern and admiration. "I didn't want to worry you," Grace replied with a small smile. "I just wanted to help." Ronald pulled her into a tight embrace. "You've done more than help, Grace. You've saved me and the company." With the mystery resolved, Ronald addressed the employees once again, explaining the situation and reaffirming his trust in Eduardo. The staff's confidence in their leadership was restored, and the company began to move forward with renewed purpose. That evening, as Ronald and Grace celebrated their victory with a quiet dinner at home, Ronald raised his glass in a toast. "To you, Grace," he said, his eyes shining with gratitude. "You've shown me what it means to truly trust and believe in someone." She clinked her glass against his, smiling warmly. "And you've shown me the strength of your heart, Ronald. Together, we can face anything." Little did they know, their greatest challenge was yet to come, a challenge that would test the very foundation of their love and partnership. But for now, they cherished the hard-won peace, ready to face whatever lay ahead together. The peace Ronald and Grace had fought so hard to maintain was once again disrupted. A new wave of unsettling rumors began spreading throughout the company, this time targeting Grace Ann. Employees began questioning her involvement in Ronald's decisions, speculating that she was influencing him for personal gain. One evening, Ronald found Grace sitting quietly at their kitchen table, her expression unreadable. "Grace, what's wrong?" he asked, concern laced in his voice. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's just, everything feels so fragile again. The trust we've built, the people around us, I don't know if it'll ever be enough." Ronald took her hand in his grip firm and steady. "You've done nothing wrong, Grace. I believe in you." "But others don't," she whispered, her voice wavering. "They see you as the leader, but they're starting to doubt my place. And that's dangerous." "I'll handle it," Ronald assured her. "We'll face this head-on." That night, Ronald called for an emergency meeting with the senior management team. He addressed the growing concerns, explaining the role Grace played in his decision-making. "We've built something great together," Ronald said, his voice unwavering. "Grace has been instrumental in ensuring our success, and her contributions cannot be dismissed or questioned. If anyone has doubts about her loyalty or intentions, they are wrong." The room fell silent. Many employees shifted uneasily, but the message was clear. Grace Ann's place in the company was secure, and Ronald's trust in her was unshakable. The storm that threatened to divide them slowly began to subside. With Grace Ann's presence deeply rooted in the company's foundation, employees grew more accepting of her influence. The once whispered doubts turned into a grudging respect as her commitment to the business became evident. Ronald, standing beside her at a company gala, was proud of how far they had come. The weight of leadership no longer felt so heavy with Grace and by his side. As the night wore on, the couple found a quiet moment amidst the celebrations. Grace Ann leaned into Ronald's embrace, her eyes glimmering under the soft lights. "You've given me something truly special," she whispered, "not just in this company, but in us." Ronald pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You've made this journey worth every challenge. Together, we can overcome anything." Their bond, forged through trials and triumphs, was stronger than ever. In the weeks that followed, the company flourished under their leadership. New projects blossomed, partnerships strengthened, and the shadows of doubt were left behind. Ronald and Grace Ann stood as a united front, their shared vision guiding the company toward a promising future. One evening, as they sat together in the home office, Ronald pulled out a small, velvet box from his pocket. Grace Ann's breath caught in her throat as he opened it to reveal a delicate diamond ring. "Grace Ann," Ronald began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded without hesitation. "Yes, Ronald. Yes, I'll marry you." Their love, their resilience, and their unwavering commitment to one another were finally solidified in a union that symbolized their journey together. As they celebrated the beginning of a new chapter, the company, and their lives, a sense of peace enveloped them once again. With the shadows now behind them, Ronald and Grace Ann were ready to step into the future hand in hand, building a legacy that would endure for generations to come. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.